Today, we are speaking with Dr. Tim Cook, an award-winning author and a historian at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Dr. Cook's new book deals with the often strained relationship between Sam Hughes, Canada's First World War Minister of Militia and Defence, and Arthur Currie, the first Canadian commander of the Canadian Corps. Currie is Tim's history idol, and we reached him in Ottawa to explain why.
I think Arthur Currie is probably best known to Canadians as the Canadian Corps commander in the last third of the war. He, although of course he had a very rich and long career in Canada, before the war he was a real estate agent in Victoria and a militia officer. Although not well known to Canadians. In fact, I don't think one in probably 10,000 could have named him. But he was recognized within the militia of being a good trainer. When the war started and erupted in August of 1914, Canada found itself at war, and we didn't have much of a professional army at this point. So the Minister of Militia at the time, Sam Hughes, turned to Canadians, ordinary Canadians, militiamen. So these were the civilian soldiers to command the Canadian units going overseas. And he selected Arthur Currie as one of the three brigadiers, the infantry brigadiers. And so Currie was elevated into a very prominent position. And over the next 2.5 years while fighting on the Western Front, he proved his mettle. He was a very good general, and he learned how to fight on the Western Front. And so in June of 1917, after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, when Sir Julian Byng, the then Canadian Corps commander, was elevated up to command an army, Currie became the commander of the Canadian Corps. And it's here where he really rises to prominence and becomes a Canadian hero. And he will serve as the commander of the Canadian Corps until the end of the war, when he returns back to Canada, and faces some challenges there. He was accused of being a butcher by some, accused of having sacrificed Canadian lives. And so he had to fight for his reputation over the next couple of years. And he eventually left the military and became principal of McGill, where he was a very successful builder of that university until he died in 1933.
Tim, what was the mood in Canada at the outbreak of the First World War?
I think the first thing to remember is that we didn't have a choice in going to war. We were a proud member of the British Empire. We were a dominion without control over its foreign policy. So when Canadians woke up on the 4th of August, 1914, no one declared war here. We were automatically at war. What we did have control over is how many men we would commit to this war. And the Canadians responded with great enthusiasm. And that can be hard to figure out looking back over 90 years now, and looking back, of course, through the terrible slaughter of what we know will happen in this ghastly industrial war where machine guns and artillery and poison gas were pitted against flesh and blood. But the Canadians in 1914, they marched off proudly to war. They were scrambling over each other to get into the services, and they continued to do that. And they did so, I think, because they believed, for the most part, that this was a just war, that Germany had to be stopped. Germany had invaded Belgium in its attempt to knock out France, and Britain had been brought into the war that way. So Canada, I think we need to remember, was a proud part of the British Empire, and Currie himself was always a very proud Canadian who believed in the strength of the empire and Canada's role within it. But during the course of the war, like many Canadians, he became, I think, a Canadian nationalist. He had seen what his forces had done on the Western Front, what his soldiers could do, and of course they had, by the midpoint of the war, become a very effective fighting force where they put together victory after victory. And it was that fighting and sacrifice on the Western Front where Canada really gained a name and a reputation and a voice for itself on the world stage. And so Currie is interesting in that, like Canadians, many Canadians, I think, he grew up during the war. Now, of course, it was a very difficult period of growing up. It was a real trial by fire, both for him and the nation.
It's been said that in the First World War, Canada and Canadians first gained a sense of nationhood. How did the war impact Currie and his views on Canada and its sovereignty?
Currie, like most Canadians, this kind of evolution in thought was a very gradual one. And for him, for Currie, and I think like the 450,000 Canadians who served overseas, many of them saw how they, as Canadians, were contributing to this larger war effort. They were helping the British Empire win this ghastly war. And, of course, it was just a terrible slaughter and carnage on the Western Front, which required more and more men and just incredible endurance by all the nations involved. And the Canadians were not only fighting here and participating, but they were achieving very good results. They were proving themselves to be adept fighters. And I think it's that aspect of having, I guess to use maybe a hockey analogy or something, but playing in the big leagues helped to change a colonial mindset in Canada. Now, it's important to note that Canadians didn't come back in 1919 and say, oh, okay, we're going to sever all ties with the Empire, we're a standalone country. No, we remained a proud part of that British Empire. But something had changed in many Canadians, and it certainly changed in Sir Arthur Currie.
Now, General Currie had plenty of detractors, chief among them Sam Hughes. What would Currie's enemies have said about him?
The Canadian Corps, fighting on the Western Front, was a politically riven force. It had been put together for the most part by the Minister of Militia and Defense, Sam Hughes, and he's one of these great characters in Canadian history. He was loudmouthed, he was a bully, he was bombastic, he had this insane ego. People who ran into him thought that he was off just out of his mind. The Governor General of the day called him a conceited lunatic. And so Sam Hughes always saw this as his army. Now the problem there is that he would often appoint officers who were not qualified. And the fighting generals overseas, the three corps commanders, first General Alderson and General Byng, who were both British-born, and then later Currie, all had to fight against this interference. And they were doing so because they, of course, wanted the best people for the job, those who had learned the hard hand of war on the Western Front. So those detractors to Currie came at him partially because he was blocking these political appointments. And they accused him of being a British toady, that he was just, that he didn't understand that, good Canadians should be in command here, because Currie often put good British officers in command. There were other things about Currie, too, that he was not a charismatic figure. And this is one of the things I guess I like about him. He was an ordinary Canadian. He was a good general, and he learned how to fight on the Western Front, but he was not an inspirational leader. And so some of his own soldiers believed that, that they didn't have a great man in command. They did. And there's a wonderful quote by a soldier who, looking back on the war, he says something to the effect of, "We never knew that we had such a good general in Sir Arthur Currie. He didn't come across that way," because Currie was very good at planning operations, in gathering all of the guns and machine guns, in training the soldiers, in doing all the stuff to help lay the groundwork and the foundation for victory. But he wasn't leading from the front, and of course none of the generals were. It was a war where they had to command from the rear, and Currie helped to save lives that way. And I guess the third and final charge against Currie, and the one that stuck against him, and it was made by Sir Sam Hughes, and it's one I talk about in my new book, The Madman and the Butcher, it's the terrible casualties. Who was to blame? And we have to think here, 60,000 Canadians were killed in the Western Front, during the course of the war. 60,000 dead. Now, this is from a nation of only 8 million Canadians, so today's equivalent would be about 250,000 dead over a 4-year period. And you can imagine just the horrible effects that had on the nation. And so some Canadians blamed Currie for the losses, especially in the 100 days. And that's where Sam Hughes actually stood up in the House of Commons in March of 1919. He accuses Currie of being a butcher. He says that you have killed off Canadians unnecessarily. Now, the irony here, of course, is that Currie always fought for the Canadian soldiers. He did his best to get them more material and supplies and guns. And in the end, he saved lives. But it's those 60,000 dead, those terrible cemeteries that are still there on the Western Front, that allowed Currie's critics to come after him, and it was very difficult for Currie to refute those charges.
Yet despite all these accusations and detractions, Arthur Currie is your history idol, Tim. Can you explain to us why you admire Arthur Currie so much?
Well, Currie was an ordinary Canadian. He was He was a pre-war real estate agent, in effect. I don't think anyone would have predicted in 1914 that he would become Canada's greatest battlefield general, which is what I believe he is. He fought under extremely difficult conditions. He was a man who pushed himself relentlessly. He put in 16, 17-hour days. He barely slept. And he was killed by the war, ultimately. It shortened his life. He died at a very young age, 56 years old. And so what I admire about him, I guess, is that he represents, I think, this generation of Canadians. Now, the 600,000 Canadians who enlisted, the 450,000 or so who served overseas, almost all of them were civilian soldiers. They were farmers, they were clerks, they were bankers, they were fathers and sons and uncles. They came from across the country. And they were the ones that ultimately had to fight and sacrifice on the Western Front. And so for me, I guess Currie, he represents that generation. He never claimed to be brilliant. He never claimed to have all the answers while fighting on the Western Front. And how could he, of course? How do you defeat barbed wire and trenches and machine gun positions and artillery and poison gas and everything else? But he was willing to learn. He was willing to apply himself to try to understand how to break through the terrible stalemate on the Western Front. And he always did so with his soldiers' lives in mind. He knew that the Canadian Corps was not a peacekeeping force. You know, it was an attacking force. It had to attack. That was its role. And he knew that he also had the terrible responsibility, the burden of command, that it was up to him to send his soldiers into battle. And he struggled with that. He struggled with the fact that he was ultimately responsible for ordering men to their death. Now, that's very different than the charge made by Sam Hughes. Currie did not do it with a reckless mind. But he also knew that there were no easy victories on the Western Front. And so I guess it's a combination of those things that I find admirable about Currie, is that he was facing a very difficult challenge and task. It was often a thankless task, but in the end, he helped to achieve victory on the Western Front.